Let's talk about literary tropes and teaching tropes to our students and why they are so important. Now, if you are like many teachers and you're struggling to think about what a trope is, don't worry, you actually do know, but it's just all part of your subconscious. I'll explain in a minute. I think we get into a pickle with tropes because we struggle with, if we actually have to stop and think about them, we struggle with how they fit in to literature. So there's literary traditions, there are genre, there are stereotypes, cliches, themes, all of the things, and then we start getting into a muddle. So we're going to clarify that today. And the other thing is as I alluded to before, tropes are actually part of our a really subconscious experience when we are viewing or when we are reading. So we know very well that they are there. However, we don't really think about them in isolation a lot. So that's what we'll go over today. We'll hopefully clarify that with you. Let's start with literary traditions. So a literary tradition is simply a way of storytelling that relates to an era, a culture, and the language and the beliefs and the values of that time. So that then dictates the form that it takes. So whether it's oral or written, the themes that are explored, the symbolism that is involved, the types of characters that come in, that kind of thing. So examples are, for example, your Indigenous literary traditions are generally orally told, often with gods, demigods, lots of connection with the environment, walking with the ancestors and so on. Your Victorian Gothic tradition, this is an easy one for students to understand as well, because it involves vampires, gargoyles, those dark, damp concrete buildings and so on. When I was at uni, I studied romantic poetry and prose. So that's all about your pastoral stuff and your thy and your thou and all the airy fairiness of romanticizing the environment and people and all of the things. So the trouble is, our students are not widely read. So we automatically assume that explaining what a literary tradition is to them is going to be difficult. But no, they do understand the differences in eras. They do understand the differences in cultures. They do understand that language has changed over time. So that's your starting point. They also understand that that there are different symbols and values that go along with different cultures. For example, your gargoyles or your demigods or your, female warrior. And that brings us to our next point, which is genre. Genre. I'm pretty sure we all understand what genre is. So your horrors, your comedies, your romances, your sci-fi stories, that kind of thing. That's your genre. Students understand those really well and they will have their favorites, so tap into those. Now, where does this fit in with literary tradition? So you can think of literary tradition as being along the top, and underneath that is genre. Now you can have the genre of a horror story, for example, created by lots of different literary traditions. For example, a horror story in, say, Indigenous traditions, literary traditions, might involve the earth swallowing you up, interactions with angry gods, things like that. A horror story in the Victorian era, as I said before, might involve your gargoyles, your vampires, and so on, your Victorian Gothic era. A horror story in the modern era might involve rogue AI, a nasty virus, those dystopian settings, that kind of thing. Now, all of those things that I'm listing are tropes. So let's get into tropes now. Tropes. This is what we're all here for, right? Now, I've already listed off a whole lot of tropes to do with literary traditions and genre. So your gargoyles, your vampires, and so on. So tropes are storytelling building blocks. that we expect to find when we pick up a certain genre or a story from a specific literary tradition. For example, The Chosen One, The Reluctant Hero, The Portal into Another World. A really easy way to have students think about what a trope is to start with tropes about women. Now, how many times have we gone over this? I know, but tropes. Think about the damsel in distress tied to the railway lines in a 1920s movie or something like that. Think about the other extreme, the women warrior, the Katniss Everdeen's, the Wonder Womans that are out there. Think about the prickly businesswoman. In order to be high up in business, they have to be a real cow, that kind of thing. These are all tropes that make us think about women in a certain way, and we'll get on to that side of things in a minute. So bearing in mind the example about women that I just used when we're talking about tropes, we have then our stereotypes. So an oversimplified, fixed idea about a group of people. So literature obviously reflects what we believe and do in our society, but then we read or view that literature and it perpetuates those stereotypes, doesn't it? So this is why it's really important to think about tropes in the literature that we study with students. So apart from the examples of women that I've given you that become stereotypes, have a think about things like the computer nerd, or have a think about how men have been stereotyped through those tropes of the big muscly man that never cries, things like that. So that's a trope that has become a stereotype. Stepmothers, think of all the fairy tales in the world, kind of thing, where the stepmother is always cruel to her stepchildren. So that's a stereotype. I'm a stepmom. Does that mean I'm like that? Probably. Okay, so you can see how tropes become stereotypes, and they can be very dangerous things, therefore, and this is why we want our students to think critically about the tropes in the literature that we study with them. Let's go over a couple of ways to make tropes easier to understand, for the students to understand and for ourselves. So first thing is, I think it's a good idea to categorize tropes according to the elements of literature. So you have your character tropes, your relation. I've broken it up like this. So characters, relationships, settings, objects, plots/events. So character tropes, the reluctant hero, the outsider, the damsel in distress, the mentor, the dark lord, that kind of thing. Relationships, forbidden love, love at first sight, the love triangle, that kind of thing, the betrayal, toxic relationships. Settings, as I said before, the decimated city, the dark enchanted forest that we associate with fantasy novels. Objects, the portal, the prophecy, and so on. And plots, the hero's journey, the car chase, because we're talking about events as well, and plots, the car chase. There's always a car chase. My mum always complains about there has to be a car chase in every single episode or whatever. Okay, so that's an easy way to help students understand tropes, is by categorizing them. The other thing is to maybe create a visual scrapbook of tropes that depict certain character types or relationships, that kind of thing. So they could have all their tropes about women or tropes about men in their scrapbook. So the visual scrapbook, the one time that, there are times when devices are good, that's one. So you're going to be wanting to go a bit deeper by making comparisons. We've already talked about some comparisons. So, for example, you can start with one genre. I used the horror story before, so we'll carry on with that. One genre, look at the tropes that are common in that genre across the different literary traditions. So, as I said before, you've got your indigenous literary traditions with your gods and your demigods and your interactions between earth and sky and the clashes and things. You've got your horror story and Gothic Victorian literature, which is your vampires, your gargoyles, and so on. And you have got your horror stories in modern day, so your rogue AI and so on. So that's pretty easy to grasp. The other thing you can do that I really like is you can take the look at Indigenous writers or storytellers and go from there. So the Indigenous storytelling from the past, the oral storytelling and the proud warriors and the strong communities and so on, and then look at Indigenous writers of the modern era, where you often have that character or that narrator who is struggling to belong, looking for that place where they belong, looking for their identity, and so on, trying to keep their language alive. So there's quite a difference there in that tone coming through. The other thing, as I also alluded to before, is you can take tropes that represent one kind of thing, and I think character is always the key for tropes. And so the easy one, as I said before, is the women, and look at how women are represented across the literary traditions as well. So everything from the women who are the commodities to be married off, to the damsels in distress, to the housewives, to the crabby businesswoman, because you can't be nice and a businesswoman apparently, and also your Katniss Everdeen women warriors. So 3 different ways of comparing your tropes there, and that's in the blog, because that's quite a lot, so you might want to read it in the blog, which I'll link below. I think if you really want to get the meat on the bones of your literature study, in terms of tropes, you stick to the character tropes, in my humble opinion, because we want to think about how those tropes represent groups of people in our society, because we want our students to become great critical thinkers. We want them to question what's going on out in society. So this is a really great way to do it. So what group of people in particular does that trope represent? What does that trope suggest about that group of people? To what extent does that trope challenge or reinforce stereotypes? Are they positive, negative? How has that trope changed over time, as I alluded to before? That kind of thing. Then you can go into the empathy side of things. Well, how would that, particularly if it's a modern day trope, how would that group that trope represents feel about that trope? Now, one of the things that I like the idea of is getting students to think about, well, if I was a trope, think about who they are, their culture, their age, their values, how they live their life, that kind of thing. Imagine if their type was represented in literature. What would that trope look like? And getting them to draw, label, describe that trope. I think that would be a really cool thing, because perhaps they feel strong, they've got a strong sense of identity, so they might like a trope who is warrior-like, who is outspoken, but has lovely manners. That kind of thing. So I think if they are thinking about tropes to represent themselves, that might help them get that sense of empathy, which in turn helps them critique literature better. So that's getting students' opinions on tropes is a really strong thing, because they love giving you their opinions anyway, right? And with that, you can then tie things into their personal reading as well with tropes. So what tropes do you like to see in your favourite genre? So start with their favourite genre first. What tropes do you expect to see? What tropes do you like to see? What if those tropes weren't present in that genre that you love so much? Would it be confronting? Would it be just weird, dumb? Would it get you thinking a little bit more? So that's quite a neat, fun way to get students involved with tropes. Of course, then you move on to, purpose. What is the author, director purpose in depicting this group of people with this trope? What are they trying to do? How are they trying to affect us? What are they trying to reflect about society? So it's about portrayal and it's about purpose. So those are your deeper things to study when it comes to tropes. Every time I do one of these videos, I think I'm not going to rabbit on, and I've rabbited on. Anyway, I hope that this little spiel has given you a better understanding of what a trope is, but also a better understanding of how you can focus on tropes for your class text study to help your students think more critically and to help them get some meat on the bones of those literary essays, but ultimately to help them become, better parts of our society, better contributors to our society, because they will think critically and they will think about those stereotypes and they will question. To dream. Okay, have fun.